If you have your Bibles open, I'd like to invite you to turn to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 is where we will continue our study on this man named Peter, Simon Peter to be a matter of fact, and often called Cephas, especially by Paul. And we are looking at in this series the idea of being beyond denial, and really just looking at that there's more to Peter's life than his denying Christ. And that's something that is really going to come to a point tonight, because this is actually the lesson where we're going to uncover the denial and how that there's more to his denying Christ than maybe we initially see. And just to kind of give a brief recap, and I know you're looking at this, you're thinking, man, this guy's going to talk about baking again. This is just a good image of sifting that I could find, because it's really the title of the lesson, The Man Who Was Sifted. I believe, and I've said this every week so far in our study, I believe that there is a defining moment in every person's life. It can be a series of moments that lead up to one, or it can be just something drastic that happens. No matter what, I believe that there comes a time when you decide, this is who I am going to be. And I'm not saying you can't change your mind on that, but it takes a lot of work. You know, most of the time we're molded by our experiences, but I believe that there might be that one experience over all the others that determine the outcome of your life. And I believe with Peter, we often look at this moment where he denies Jesus, and we just think, yeah, that's it. That was a big moment in his life. Well, sure it was. And we could say, well, for Thomas, his big moment was when he doubted Jesus' resurrection. Well, it was a big moment. Was it the deciding factor in their faith, however? That's the question. Last week we looked at a time in which Peter literally went through a storm. We saw the Sea of Galilee, and although Jesus had spoken and he had fed the 5,000, that the people misunderstood what that meant, and they're going to force him to become king. In fact, we saw that this past Wednesday night in our Bible study. And so there's Peter and the other apostles, and they're in this boat, and this storm overtakes them, and Jesus, seeing what they're going through, although he's alone on the mountain praying to his God, his Father, he sees how they're struggling, so he goes down to them. And I love how Jesus, he doesn't just calm the storm at the edge of the lake, instead he walks on top of the storm. And I think that demonstrated not only to the disciples, but also to us, that Jesus has power over any storm we may ever experience. And I love that imagery. And how Peter, he called Jesus out and said, Jesus, if it is you, command me to come out there and I will. And Jesus did. So Peter, he's looking at Jesus, and he's walking, and then there's this moment, perhaps he was at the midpoint, we don't know, but he sees that the boat is far past him, and he sees Jesus is still a ways off. And things are feeling a little rocky. And Peter takes his eyes off Jesus, looks around, and he begins to sink. But what I love about Peter is in his moment of desperation, he calls out, Lord, save me. And I think, we are often facing difficult times in which perhaps the waves are surging around us, or the storm is beating against us. Maybe we feel like we are sinking, the waters are overwhelming us. Whatever it is, do we, in that moment of need, do we truly trust that Jesus will save? Or are we trying to battle our own issues? Are we trying to solve them ourselves rather than turning them over to the Master? So that's something that we saw last week. And this week we are looking at the man who was sifted. And I use this imagery because if you've ever experienced baking, you know that there are certain recipes that call for you to sift the flour and sift the sugar and sift other things to kind of get some of the things that may not help bake the product more smoothly. You have to first sift them out. And that's sort of the context that Jesus uses with Peter, although he uses a more agricultural term. This might just stick in our heads a little bit better. It's a moment in which Jesus has a heart-to-heart with not just Peter, with all his disciples. And it's a moment in which he shares with them that they're about to face their darkest hour. And Peter especially, Jesus, he shows special attention, special focus, and really a special rebuke toward Peter. And he says, if you've been reading the bulletin articles, Peter's name was Simon, but Jesus gave him somewhat of a nickname to strengthen him. But when Jesus often used Simon, it was kind of a reminder of who Peter used to be versus who he's supposed to be. And Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan, he has demanded permission for you that he may sift you like wheat. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. And so if you have your Bibles again, please look with me in Luke 22. But before we delve into the text, again, this is a moment where people really, they're ready to condemn Peter or just say, wow, Peter, if it had been me, I would have done something different. And I just want us to think in our own hearts, given the situation, would I have said what Peter said to Jesus when Jesus said, you know what? Your faith is about to be shaken. Would you have so readily accepted that, saying, you know what, Jesus? You know better than I do. I trust you. And I know I'm about to face a difficult time. Or would you have been like Peter and say, no, Lord, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. I would die for you. And when the hour came, would we have truly said, you know what? Arrest me now, for I am a follower of Christ. Most of us have never been in that situation, if not any of us have ever been in a situation of being arrested for our beliefs. Or would we have been like Peter, backing away into the shadows, denying the one who we call our master? So let's look at the text together and let's see more about this man who was sifted. Beginning at verse 31. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. Let's look at this account together. I want us to first notice someone being in denial, literally, and just not really having the sense of what is occurring. And I want to kind of set the scene. I want to have the setting before your eyes just to make sure that we know what is occurring. We want the story in context, the event unfolding before our eyes. We want to make sure we have the proper view, the vantage point. So here it is, at this sacred ceremony, the Lord's Supper. But this is not like any other Lord's Supper the disciples have ever experienced, even when they've experienced it with Jesus. See, Jesus does a few different things during this particular service, so to speak. First, he lets them know, this is the last time I'm going to eat this with you. This is something I've been earnest about before I begin to suffer. In fact, you read that in Luke chapter 24, and you read that in verse 15. And then as the supper continues, he repurposes what they've grown up hearing, that this Passover, it's all about when the Lord passed over the Israelites, when he was exercising judgment on the Egyptians. And they were called to paint over their doorposts the blood of the Lamb. And they were to eat unleavened bread so that they could leave with haste. And there's all different types of imagery that is used. And Jesus says, wait. The bread represents my body. The cup represents my blood. And then there's a third change in what they were expecting. While Jesus, he's partaking of this, his soul is in anguish, and he says, one of you is going to betray me. And at this point, you can imagine the conversation coming to a standstill, and all of them going around saying, surely it's not I, Lord. Surely it's not me. I mean, there are only 12 of them, and then Jesus. So you have to think that this must have been an interesting conversation. And what I like about Luke's account is Luke goes from the Lord's Supper conversation to who is the greatest. And I can only imagine that the bridge between these two is they're talking about who would betray Jesus, and someone begins by saying, oh, no. It wouldn't be me because I'm the treasurer. Jesus trusted me with the finances. Then a few of them crop up and say, wait, it's not us. We're part of Jesus' inner circle. Okay, we saw him transfigure at the mount. If anybody had the right kind of faith, it'd be us. And then, of course, the one who likes to speak the most, well, it's not me. I confess Jesus was the Christ first. So if anything, I'm the least suspect. I'm not the person that would do this. And And so Luke is kind of painting this image of going from the Lord's Supper conversation to the betrayal, to them saying, well, it's not me, and having this sort of boasting contest of who is the greatest. And Jesus, he has to put a stop to what is happening. And he says, you know what? I am the greatest among you at this table, yet I am here to serve. He gives them an opportunity. He reminds them gently that they're all going to be equal in the kingdom. He says in verse 29, I assign to you as my Father assigned to me a kingdom that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. So he lets them know there isn't this favoritism being shown. There isn't a greater than or less than among this group. All of you are going to have a place in my kingdom. But then Jesus, he zeroes in on Peter. And again, this is my imagination at work. This is only conjecture, but I wouldn't be surprised with the amount that Peter talks. I wouldn't be surprised if he was sort of the ringleader in this conversation about who is the greatest. And so Jesus, he turns to Simon Peter, this individual that he has been molding, and we might use the phrase grooming to be a leader. And he says to Peter, Simon, Simon, Satan has demanded to have you. He has demanded permission. And Simon, he's going to sift you like wheat. I want us to notice a couple things about this phrase before we carry on. I want to give you a synopsis about this sifting. So first of all, when we read about Simon being sifted like wheat, again, in our mind, what I immediately thought of is when you bake and you have the flour and the sugar and some salt and all this other stuff, and you have it all in a bowl. Sometimes the recipe calls for you to take the sifter and you pour it through and then you kind of shake it to make sure only the good comes through. Nothing that is kind of formed and granulated together makes it into the batch, but everything's going to be nice and light and airy. Well, in their standard, in their culture, during the harvest, when they had the wheat and they gathered the wheat together, still the chaff. So they would gather on this threshing floor, and after they had taken care of the wheat, well, they still had the wheat mixed in with the chaff. So they'd take a winnowing fan or some other instrument, and they would throw up the wheat and the chaff together, throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow the chaff away. And the wheat would fall to the ground. So when Jesus tells Simon that Satan, first of all, Satan has demanded access. He's demanded permission. It reminds me of a time when Satan demanded permission to do something to someone else. Job. Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2. And I think this is some of a gentle reminder that Satan still has to work within the confines and limitations God has set for him. Satan never works with power that overtakes God's design. And I think about how God set limitations on Satan with Job. And Jesus is telling Simon, Simon, listen, Satan, he's about to shake you. But here's something unique. I have studied this passage a couple of times, and I've heard a lot of sermons on this passage, but something I never knew is that when Jesus said he has demanded to have you, sift you like wheat, that word you is plural. Jesus wasn't only talking to Simon. He's talking to all of them. They were all about to experience a violent shakedown, where their faith was going to be tested beyond what they could ever imagine. And that's why Jesus, he at first speaks to Simon, but he's still including the rest of them. But he goes back to zeroing in on Simon. And he says, Simon, I've prayed for you. And we're going to talk about that prayer more in just a minute. But he said, I've prayed for you that when you've come back to your senses, when you've turned back around, you'll strengthen your brothers. And of course, Peter goes, wait. Jesus, you know me. I would never do anything like that. I would go to prison for you, and I would die for you. He says, I'm not about to be shaken. And of course, Jesus tells him, Simon, this time tomorrow, you've already denied me 3 times. Turn 1 page, maybe 2 pages in your Bible. Let's see this event unfold. And I think in Simon's mind, in Peter's mind, he imagined this great battle. Because he imagines this kingdom going to come, and it's going to come with force. And he imagines, and Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. So all this time, Peter's hearing all these words, these military words, and he's thinking there's going to be a great battle, and boy, I'm going to be ready to fight to the death for Jesus. And he even tried in the garden. You know what? That's not how Jesus operates. Frankly, it's not how Satan operates when he tempts. See, Jesus, when Simon swung out with a sword to injure somebody, Jesus not only told Simon to stop, he took time out of his arrest to heal the one arresting him. And then Satan, the way he works, he doesn't just go in after with the obvious attack. Simon thinks, well, I'm never going to deny Jesus because I'm going to fight to the death. Satan instead waited for an opportunity where he could exploit Simon's weakness. And that's when the defenses are down in public. Is he willing to confess Jesus is Lord, even at risking his own life? See, Satan doesn't tempt us when we're strong in the Lord. He waits for an opportunity that he can exploit. Even at the midst of victory, we can be at our weakest. So here's Simon. So they seize him and they lead him away, verse 54. And when they kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat together down, Peter, he sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light, and looking closely at him, said, this man also was with him. Out of the challenges he's going to face where he can either confess Jesus or deny Jesus, the first one is to a servant girl. Now, in this day and age, a woman could not give testimony in court. Their eyewitness account will be considered skewed. Furthermore, this person was not a human being in the sense of the Roman Empire. They were property. They were a servant. So when this girl comes to Simon and says, wait a minute, I think you were with him. Yeah, you look like you were there at the arrest. Peter is afraid of a servant girl. Peter so brazenly went on about how he was going to die defending Jesus, but the moment one person comes, one individual of little reputation among all the crowds challenges him, he begins backing up. Well, I don't know the person. I don't know what you're talking about. Woman, I do not know him. I want you to know something else. Immediately, someone else. Is that what your passage says? A little later. So here's Simon, and he's warming up by the fire. It's been a long night. It didn't go anywhere the way he thought it would. And this girl comes up to him and says, wait, I've seen you before. No, it wasn't me. Some time passes. That gives him an opportunity to stew, to meditate, to think, what is happening? What is going on? But a little time later, someone else comes up to him and says, wait a minute. You are also one of them. And he said, man, I am not. As curious as the first one was, more confident as the second. As vague as he is in the first denial, more confident he is in the second, going from, no, I don't know him, to saying, I am not a part of his group. And after an interval of about an hour, so much time passes. Maybe he's forgotten about the first 2 occurrences. After another hour, another insisted, saying, certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean. The way he talked called him out, his accent. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you're talking about. And in other accounts, specifically Matthew says that Peter cursed and he denied Jesus. And the rooster crowed. And Luke's account specifically says, Jesus, the Lord, turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered how Jesus said, you wouldn't last a day, Peter. And he wept bitterly. Just thinking about this so far, this is nothing you haven't heard before about Peter denying Jesus. But, we have to pause and reflect sometimes about where our faith stands. Especially when Jesus confronts us about our weakness. And He tells us when our trials are going to come and we're going to be shaken. And we are just so confident, so proud in our faith that we can't see that we're about to be steamrolled. Jesus not only told Simon he was going to fail, He told him, you don't even have many hours left before you fail. Perhaps if Simon had been more open to hear what Jesus had to say, things might have been different. But Peter wept bitterly. But that's not the end of the story. As a matter of fact, we didn't cover the middle of the story. If we ended here and had the invitation song, I don't know if any of us would walk away with a cheerful heart. Just thinking, wow, so it's just inevitable. We're all going to fail Christ. Well, what is there left for me if I'm going to fail Jesus? I want you to notice as our time draws to a close what Jesus did for Peter. Back up with me to verse 32 of Luke 22. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. As I've told you before, every single title in this series is vague for a reason. The man who went fishing, the man who went on a walk, the man who was sifted. It's vague because it has twofold meaning. It refers both to Peter and what he experienced, whether fishing or walking on water or being sifted, but also refers to Jesus because Peter was not the only one sifted that day. Jesus too was also violently shaken in the garden. Have you ever heard that trouble comes in threes? Have you ever heard that phrase before? And it's amazing how many threes you can find, or rather, how many twos you can find, because you know you're next. That's kind of how that works. Well, I think about how Peter, he has 3 opportunities to confess Jesus as Lord. And every single time he denies Christ. And then I look back and I think, well, wait, there was a time before Jesus' ministry when he had 3 opportunities to take out his own way, to leave the Father, to take the easy path. And all 3 times, he stayed true to God. And then I think, well, wait, how many times did Jesus pray in the garden? 3. Perhaps there were 3 opportunities in the garden which Jesus' soul was facing such agony. He heard the call of temptation once again, in which he knew that there could be another way. There had to be another way. He had a following. He had close disciples. They would defend him with their lives. As a matter of fact, one of them confessed he'd die for Jesus. 3 times he prayed, not my will, but your will be done. And then I read Luke 22, when Jesus says, Simon, you're about to be shaken. And I have 2 thoughts in my mind. First, Jesus understood exactly what that was going to feel like, because Jesus experienced it in the wilderness, and he was about to experience it in the garden. But furthermore, Jesus, his reaction to Simon's peril was to pray. And I'm thinking, man, if I was Jesus and this guy's just failed me time after time after time again, and he's going around boasting how great he is and how strong of faith he is and how he would die for his beliefs, and I know he's not going to, would I even pray for him? And I think Jesus prayed for Simon, and then later in the garden, Jesus said, Simon, could you pray for me? And all 3 times, Simon, he tried, but he fell asleep. And I look at the weakness of man versus the strength of God, and I am in awe. And I think when Jesus says, this is my prayer for you, that your faith won't fail. You know, at the first glance, at the first reading, we might think, well, you know what, I guess even Jesus has unanswered prayers because Simon's faith did fail him when he was tested. I don't think that's exactly what Jesus is referring to. Because first of all, I notice that Jesus never prayed for anything which did not include, not my will, but your will, Father. I don't think he was praying for Peter's trial. I think he was praying for Peter's faith after the trial. He was praying, after you are violently shaken, Peter, I'm praying that you can hold on. Because we see another individual who betrayed Jesus. And boy, he wept. And boy, he was sorry for what he did. In fact, he returned the blood money that he had received. But the difference between Judas and Peter was faith. Peter, he turned back to Christ. And that's when Jesus prayed, when you have been turned, that phrase could mean when you've been converted, but most likely in the sense it means when you have repented, strengthen your brothers because they're weak too. They all fled the scene when Jesus needed him most. And again, I think, how amazing God is. Because when Jesus knew the heart of Judas, he still washed his feet. And when Jesus knew the heart of Simon Peter, he still prayed for him. Peter, he denied Jesus to save his own life. But Jesus sacrificed his own life because he loved Peter. And even though he did that, even though Peter couldn't stay awake, Jesus still prayed for him, and he continued to pray for Peter's faith that Peter could come through the end of this. And I think, man, Jesus, he just won't give up on anybody. And then how amazing it is for me to think, well, wait, why would he ever give up on anyone? He won't ever give up on me. Because we are all brazen like Peter. We all confidently say, well, if I had been in that situation, things would have been different. I would have been arrested alongside Jesus. I would have faced the trials telling Jesus everything's going to be okay. But when the moment comes, when adversity strikes, from time to time we still disappoint our Lord. But something I have to remember is that Jesus prays for us too. Jesus is our mediator. He is our go-between. He is the one that goes to the Father on our behalf. And I can't help but recall 1 John 2, verse 1. He says, my little children, I write these things that you do not sin, but if anyone does sin, we have an advocate. We have a representative with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. The man who was sifted was the man who was shaken violently during a trial by temptation. One man, when he was shaken, decided to save his own skin, and he wept bitterly because of it. The other man, when he was shaken, he said, not my will, but yours be done. And I have to remember that when I go through life and I go through as a child of God, when I face failures, I have to remember Jesus is praying for my faith. Although this lesson is somewhat dark and And it brings some concern that we have to face our own weaknesses rather than ignore them and follow our own pride. I have to remember that even when I struggle, even when I fail, even when I come short to God's glory, Jesus is still waiting for me. He's praying for me that my faith can be strong, even when I doubt myself or I think it's the end. Next week, we're going to look at the man who opened up the kingdom. This is not the end of Peter's life. In fact, this is only the beginning. For Jesus is going to restore Peter. Peter's going to preach an amazing lesson. And 3,000 souls will be added because one person decided to move beyond his own denial and trust in his Lord. If there's anything you need tonight, perhaps you're facing your own difficulties. Perhaps you thought you were stronger than what you seem, and you failed miserably. Maybe you just have a burden on your heart. Maybe you have a problem in your life, and you just don't know what to do. Maybe you need a stronger faith. If you need to become a child of God, be baptized into Christ this evening. Have your sins washed away. If you are a child of God and you need prayers for strength, don't hesitate. Come now while we stand, while we sing.